Alright guys, welcome to Formula 1 News. First comment on Red Bull Racing on their development of the RB21, and it's not looking all sunshine and rainbows coming out of the Red Bull camp as it stands. Pierre Wache generally is relatively pessimistic when it comes to progress, but he definitely says that finding any performance going into next season is going to be a massive challenge at a time when McLaren and certainly Ferrari are massively revamping their car for next year. Is the RB21 on this evidence going to be good enough for Max to win the title again? Very much on Twitter, your thoughts in the comments below. Hit the like button if you enjoy. Subscribe if you're new as always. Starting with this quickly on George Russell, he was talking about his victories and performances this season, and I thought his comments on this are interesting, of course, because he dominated in Las Vegas, won comfortably from pole position in the end. Obviously, they were so good in qualifying on the Saturday, then he closed out the victory on the Sunday as well. But he actually reckoned that his performance in Spa was better. This, of course, being somewhat controversial, right? Because he won in Spa on track with the one-stop strategy. Now, the one-stop, as far as we understand, contributed to the eventual disqualification. Now, look, did Russell do a great job managing the tyres to make it that far, defending from Hamilton towards the end when necessary? Sure. And of course, it was a controversial race because Hamilton was not informed by the team that the one-stop was even possible. He wasn't aware he was covering potentially for Russell. And of course, Hamilton was not very happy at the end of the Grand Prix after what seemed to be a certain victory disappeared when Russell stayed out in front and did a great job. But of course, in the end, he was underweight, the car was disqualified, and that was partly because of the one-stop, the extra wear on the tyres and stuff like this that contributed to that problem. So yeah, it's interesting because, you know, Russell arguably won that race because the car was too light, and therefore, was it really that great of a performance? Of course, that's the question. Russell, I'm sure, in the car himself feels like he did a phenomenal job. He reckons that was his best performance of the season, but of course, he ends it with 0 points on the board. Quickly on Williams, they spent the entire season struggling with crash damage, and Albon talked about how effectively the weight saving that they did, or they tried to do, didn't really go to plan because they added further weight to the car, led to additional crash damage as well, and it was an absolute disaster. These are the numbers, by the way. Of course, in second place comes pretty much just Sergio Perez, but he obviously had a fair few incidents himself. This is just estimated. It's difficult to say what the actual numbers would look like. But yeah, McLaren, $2.5 million of crash damage. This is the type of number that the teams would like to budget. I mean, obviously this is just damage in general. When other cars hit you, you're never going to escape incidents, and they're always going to be costly. So, you know, when Magnussen went into Perez in obviously Monaco, that was a pretty big deal. But to be fair, even with Magnussen having a controversial season, the amount of damage that they incurred probably wasn't the biggest. Alpine, Haas, Stake F1 team, RB, we get to Mercedes kind of middle of the pack, but yeah, Williams were in a different league this season. And the funny thing was, of course, it wasn't just Logan Sargent. He, of course, contributed a lot, but even when they brought in Colapinto, initially he was good, then in Brazil and others, he had a bit of a harder time, and even Alex Albon, notably Australia, definitely contributed to this number. So you think about the fact that a budget cap is about $135 million. Yes, there are exemptions, but a difference between, you know, $10 million in crash damage from where Williams were to where the average team was, that's a lot of money that could be spent on development elsewhere. And of course, it's sure crash damage, but also the engineers, instead of working on upgrades and other things, you know, they've got to work on putting together new parts that need to be replaced, or the mechanics have to be working overtime to make these things happen. So yeah, you can't afford numbers like that. Williams know it. Of course, there was even talk they might not even be able to finish out the season, right? Because there was some discussion they might simply not have the parts of the cars to close out the year. They did eventually get there though. Obviously, Albon Colapinto was 11-6, pretty interesting to close out the season. Ocon and Gasly finished pretty similar. And Tsunoda Lawson, 10-2 notably. This is combined race and qualifying head-to-heads. To be fair to Lawson, he was pretty good in sprint qualifying, but that's not particularly counted here. So, yeah, this is combined race and quali head-to-heads during the course of the season. Of course, if you qualify ahead, increases the chances you're going to finish ahead as well. The notable numbers really for this Red Bull discussion, though, are the following. With Tsunoda and Lawson 10-2, obviously the numbers are a little bit different to that. Sure, a driver may finish ahead of the other driver many a time, but what's the delta between them? That's kind of the important number. But, yeah, Verstappen, Perez, 46-2. not ideal at all. And obviously Max did a great season. Marco says that nobody else in his position would have closed out the championship. Obviously that's a controversial statement. Fred Vasseur would disagree, maybe Toto Wolff would disagree, certainly Andrea Stella and Zach Brown, and maybe the drivers would disagree, because I'm sure Lando would say, well, if I was in that car, I would have equally won the races that Max did at the start of the season, and then, when the car was the best, and then executed from there. But look, Max probably did a better job than anyone else would have in that situation, but of course achieved it to some degree controversially with some of the incidents in Mexico, for example, and in Austin, when Max comes out afterwards and says, look, you've got to do what you've got to do to win the championship. Now, Lawson is going to be his teammate next year. Perez is gone after a truly historic underperformance this season, and it's sensible that somebody else needed to get the drive. Lawson, though, is doing a lot of talking, and whether it's going to work out for him, I think is a bit of a question. But he was told by Marco, basically, don't go in there trying to beat Max. And Lawson has admitted this. He did say after his first season, he wants to be at the point where he could challenge Max. Look, whether he'll be able to do that is a matter for debate. But he's got to do better than Perez. We saw the numbers the other day. Red Bull said you've got to be within 3/10 of Max. That was the rumour anyway. If he's in that kind of ballpark, they might keep him around. But of course, 3/10 could be P1, P2, could be P1, P8, depending on the relative performance of the cars, and we'll discuss that in a second. But Lawson also went on to say this, and again, this is one of those statements where he's not wrong necessarily, and he is, again, saying the words that Red Bull would want him to say. But I do fear that if it doesn't go to plan for Lawson, these words may quite quickly come back to bite him. Because on some level, this is a criticism of Perez here, if you read between the lines a little bit. Because he was obviously asked the question, how are you going to get on with the car? And he says, in terms of driving styles, I don't really know if I believe in it so much. I think you have certain things you like a car to do, sure. But I also think for me, I spend a lot of time developing that car as well as a junior and as a reserve for the last couple of years. And I feel like I understand quite well the way the car drives. So sure, fair enough. Like, he believes that he has helped develop, and maybe this is true in part, the direction of the RB20, RB19, whatever, over the last couple of years as a reserve driver for them. Obviously, I wouldn't want to take credit for the development of the RB20, but he did say, I feel like I understand the way the car drives. Of course, still a faster car than what he was driving this season, but I also don't fully believe in the idea that this doesn't suit your driving style. I think as drivers, we are professionals. We have to adapt to whatever we're driving. And this is all, fair enough. I don't disagree with what Lawson says here, really. But I still think it's interesting timing when he's effectively, because people always say this about Perez, right? And every teammate that Max has had. Max like a car super on the front nose. Perez likes a car more on the rear. Circuits like Baku, he tends to prefer more rear limited. And of course, fundamentally, that's going to be a bit of a problem. But the point still tends to stand that Max likes his car set up in a quite extreme way. And obviously, because he's the number one driver, his preferences get the most weight in the decisions that Red Bull make in terms of their development. So Lawson's now coming out and saying, well, driving style is no excuse. I wouldn't say Perez precisely made that excuse, but it was often a talking point over the last few teammates Max has had to say, oh, well, their driving styles aren't going to mesh with the car, so you can justify a little bit of their underperformance with respect to Max. Lawson says, you can't justify it, you've just got to adapt. And I think that's a good mentality, but it may be a mentality that comes back to bite him, I think is what some people are saying. But look, will he do better than Perez? I guess that depends to some degree on whether he gets a full season in the car. Obviously, we know that Flavio Briatore at Alpine has been saying, well, if Jack Doohan isn't quick enough, we're going to get rid of him. And they got rid of Sergio Perez, but wow, it took them a lot of underperformances to do that. We know that there were sponsor obligations potentially off the track as well, which made it difficult to get rid of Perez. But of course, they did decide to pull the trigger on that. And Liam Lawson maybe doesn't have quite the same backing, nowhere near really, that Perez might. Colapinto was considered to be a potential replacement in the Red Bull family because of the heavy South American backing. And Lawson, brings some commercial interest, but not what Perez did, and not even what a guy like Ricciardo did. Of course, both individuals departing that family, if you want to call it that, over the last year or so. Max was talking about the RB21, however, And this is the big question, really, because Lawson's success, Max's success, will depend on the success of the RB21 in the wind tunnel that they're currently working on. Max wants a new livery as well. Max, it seems, is fed up with the dull blue matte liveries of the last few years, and he made the statement that he preferred the older school Red Bull liveries of, a decade and a bit ago, with a bit shinier, a bit more colour on them. And I don't think Max is expecting the car to look any different for next year, but he would like to see it happen. I mean, even to be fair to Mercedes, they've switched things up a fair bit over the last few years. The Red Bull, it is a classic livery, to be fair, but I don't disagree with Max. It might be nice to see something a little bit different. But then again, Red Bull might think, well, I've had the same livery the whole of this regulation cycle. Why would we change something that works? But Max wants just something different, and I can understand why. Is the car going to be any good, though? Because Pierre Wache has been talking about this, obviously technical director over there at Red Bull Racing, heading up the program, especially now Newey has departed. Pierre Wache is in. They've got a couple of other top guys over there as well. Of course, Newey, we believe part of the reason for his departure was that he felt like he wasn't getting the credit that maybe he deserved in terms of the success of that car over the last couple of years. Red Bull and Horner would often say, well, it's not a one-man team. We've got a good development team behind the scenes here, and Newey, well, there were various reasons, it seems, why he decided to leave Red Bull when he did. But this will be the first Red Bull in a very long time that does not have any Newey touches. It may have some hints of Newey still around because it is going to be fundamentally based to some degree on what Red Bull have produced over the last few years. We also know that Newey said when he was departing the team back in Miami, I think he made the statement that he's pretty happy with this year's car, but there's one thing that he doesn't like. And we still never really figured out what that was. Of course, there was lots of speculation on it. And then Newey's words were somewhat prophetic because it wasn't far after he said that the car really started to take a bit of a nosedive in terms of performance. So clearly something wrong with it, but Newey had recognised what that was and wanted to fix it. So if Newey knew that then, the rest of the team knew that, and you can imagine they're working on it. So I'm sure there will be some Newey touches on this car, but it's not going to be considered an Adrian Newey car here in 2025, the RB21, and that'll be the first time Red Bull have to some degree had to do it themselves for a rather long time. And Wache, as I say, he can be somewhat pessimistic generally, but he's not full of optimism in terms of how the RB20 is going to go. RB21, sorry. The RB20, of course, dominated the start of the season. Controversial as to why it declined in maybe the way that it did, but Wache went on to say this: for sure there will be some development, and at some tracks we will be quicker, but it's very, very difficult to find performance, talking about the final year of the regulations. Now, it's interesting what different teams are doing here. Red Bull have got to make some relatively substantial changes, but the question, of course, has been their wind tunnel, the data they have on the circuit, the correlation between that and what happens on the track compared to what happens in the simulator is not necessarily always there. And that's the challenge of Red Bull, is because, sure, they might be able to find performance in the sim. Does that translate to the track? It hasn't always done this season. So they've got to solve that problem, really, if they want to actually find real performance on the track. They will need to make, and are probably making, substantial changes to their car, but the same is true for Ferrari, and we believe the same is true for McLaren as well. And they are not saying they can't find performance. Now, of course, some teams talk to the media differently, but there does seem to be a feeling with those other teams that there is more performance to find. Of course, with these ground effect cars, it's a bit tricky because if you search for more downforce, you tend to find the car might not be in the best possible window. The cars next year will be faster. They will likely produce more dirty air than this year's cars did, but they may not be dramatically different in terms of performance to this year's car. So that's the debate that Red Bull need to have. Okay, how far do we push? How far do we just try and fix the problems and maybe even maintain the downforce in some level? But the way that Wache says, on some tracks, we will be faster and there will be some development. But it's not like he's saying, oh yeah, we're going to be quicker everywhere. I mean, the idea they'll be quicker at some circuits is like, surely Max is saying, hang on a second, do you not mean like every circuit we're going to be faster at with next year's car than this year's car, because the cars should get, maybe half a second faster year on year, whatever, on a lap time basis. But yeah, maybe not this time, maybe not with the Red Bull. I don't know if you discussed with the others, but for us, it's going to be difficult, he says. Now, I'm sure that this is true for the other teams as well. It just depends what they say. McLaren, I'm sure, Ferrari, Mercedes are also probably struggling struggling to find chunks of performance. But Red Bull say, looking at the visible aspect of the car, everyone has the same type of concept that we did in 2022. Wider bodywork at the rear. It's more about where you develop underneath the car, but we are here to do a job and develop the car as best we can. So I think that's an interesting observation as well. Of course, Newey had his ideas going into 2022, what was going to be the best. Red Bull pretty much nailed it out of the gates. The Ferrari was good at the start, but then, especially when TD39 came in, that changed the boat a little bit. Red Bull pulled away from there. Of course, the incident in France didn't help Leclerc and Ferrari's challenge either, among many other. Spain, Baku, Austria, among others, in terms of failures for Sainz, at least that race. And then there was Silverstone and Monaco. Less said about that in terms of strategy, probably the better. But, Newey got it right, as you'd expect. The other teams have copied, and the delta, therefore, between Red Bull and the rest is diminished to a substantial margin, maybe for multiple reasons that we have discussed this season. It's very frustrating for us when we don't win, and everybody in the paddock has the same vision. And he said, when are you really starting to work on the RB21? And he said, you have to define your main structure, what you're doing with the aero surface in the middle of the year. You've got no choice. It's due to production design. Even if we are quick, it takes a long time. So the point being that middle of this season, they had a good idea what they were going to try and do with the RB21. But of course, the ideas on that may have changed over the last few months. And I thought this sentence especially, saying how frustrating it is when you're not winning and everyone else in the paddock has the same idea in terms of how to design their car. Red Bull are struggling to say, well, everyone's kind of copied Red Bull's concept on some level in terms of their suspension setup, and every team has kind of converged on that. But obviously some teams are now doing it better than they did, and Red Bull are like, well, what do we do? Do we innovate further and try and go to the next level? Which, to be fair, it seemed like they tried to do with the RB20, and it worked for a couple of months. Then it started not to work for whatever reason. So the RB21, they may have to do something similar, but I wouldn't say that this is full of confidence from the Red Bull family as it stands. And even when Pablo Montoya was asked his thoughts on Max Verstappen and whether he's the favourite for next year, and he says, as it stands, Montoya feels it's impossible for Max to be favourite for next year's championship because the way the car is currently just isn't good enough. Now, of course, last year's car isn't this year's car, next year's car, but still, it's the same type of idea. So Montoya does not reckon, as it stands, based on everything that we have seen the most recent few months, and maybe what Red Bull are even saying today, that Max is the favourite for next year's championship. Who is the favourite? I think that's almost right now an impossible question to answer. But Montoya does not believe that Verstappen, as it stands, is going to be winning next year's title anywhere near easily. But very much enjoyed your thoughts on all of this stuff in the comment section below. Hit the like button if you enjoyed. Subscribe if you're new. Take care, and I'll see you next time.